Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we begin a new journey. We're reading a book that was first published in 1907 called Prophet in Babylon, written by W.J. Dawson. So let's get to it, shall we? Chapter 1. The Deacons' Meeting. The meeting of deacons of the Mayfield Avenue Union Church was nearly over, and it had not been a pleasant meeting. Nothing had been said that could be called positively offensive to the minister, the Reverend John Gaunt, but a good deal had been implied. John Gaunt had been minister of the church for nearly 7 years. He had come to it on an enthusiastic call when its prestige had somewhat declined, and the force of his personality and preaching genius had raised it, within 2 years, to a position of commanding influence. In the 4th year of his ministry, the zenith of success was reached. The pews were all let, and many persons applied for seats in vain. In the 5th year, a change began to be perceptible. There was no longer a crowd. In the 6th year, there were many vacant seats, and some of his most substantial supporters had moved into the new and distant suburbs. In the 11th year, the process of disintegration was manifest. Hence the present meeting, the object of which was the discussion of what Deacon Roberts tiresomely described as the situation. In the early years of his ministry, Gaunt had been accustomed to describe himself as more free than any minister in New York. He could preach any doctrine he pleased. He was untroubled by any question of finance. He was conscious of the atmosphere of warm loyalty among his people. When some of his less successful brethren complained of their difficulties in relationship to their people, he smiled with a suave commiseration of a superior person. It seemed to him the easiest thing in the world to manage men, to attach them to oneself, to evoke from them generous feelings and acts. "I have never had a day's trouble in my church," he was accustomed to say. This was true in the broad general sense in which he intended it, but nevertheless it had never represented the real facts of the case. He had always carried out his own policies, but he was perfectly aware that he could not have done so but for the fact of his success in the pulpit. The most contentious church critic is silent in the presence of visible success, but it does not follow that he will be always silent. Churches, like armies, live on conquest. When conquest ceases, mutiny begins. During the past year, John Gaunt had slowly come to a partial understanding of this law. It was only partial, for his own reluctance to face the facts of the case made him a slow learner. He had carefully closed his ears to many veiled hints on the part of the managers of the church, the significance of which was obvious. But the pressure of facts, however slowly exerted, cannot be continuously resisted. His own eyes told him that his congregation was falling off. To himself he explained this disastrous fact by the departure of many of his best supporters to the rapidly growing suburbs of the city. But he soon found that such explanations excited no sympathy in the minds of men like Deacon Roberts, who were accustomed to measure things by results, and who knew no other standard of measurement. The laws of finance, like natural laws, have no pity. It was useless to say to himself, as he had often done of late, that a church is not a financial affair, and ought not to be treated as such. His managers were, with one exception, men used to judging things solely from the financial standpoint, and they were quite inaccessible to sentiment. From the moment when the deficit was reported in the church accounts, he was conscious of a certain change of attitude toward him. It was then that he made the most painful discovery of his life. For the first time he realized that he was a paid servant of the church. The gross, naked reality of his relationship to his board of managers was disclosed. It had been carefully hidden during the years of success, so carefully that he had forgotten its existence. In those years his boast was true. He had not had a day's trouble in his church. Crowds hung upon his words. With the magic of his voice he could raise any sum of money he wished. And when he met his managers for the discussion of affairs, the meetings were nearly jovial, as decorum permitted. Of course, he had imagined that this happy state of things would continue. It sometimes seemed to him that he was miraculously fed, like Elijah, by ravens. His income was transferred silently to his pocket, and it seemed given rather than earned. He asked no question how it was raised. There was no need. But for months now he had been secretly uneasy, and though hitherto no word had been said to him, he was conscious in the changed looks of his managers as they grudged what they gave him. To a proud and brilliant man, this perception was torture. Some men would have sought that easy way of escape which is found in a change of pastorate. He could hardly doubt that many pulpits would welcome him, if it were known that he desired them. But here his pride blocked the way, and beneath his pride was a stratum of stubbornness, which was impenetrable. He was perfectly aware of his gifts, although the knowledge had never degenerated into vanity. He knew that he could preach as few men could, and he was not wrong when he told himself that he was preaching today better than he had preached in his life. For with all its brilliance, his mind was one that fructifies with experience, that goes on learning and broadening with the years. He had only to compare his early sermons with those preached recently to discover that his mind had made great advances in 7 years of his ministry. He told himself with some bitterness that if these poor early sermons attracted crowds, the latter sermons were infinitely better, deserving of success. Yet the plain fact met him that his career of success was abruptly closed. He no longer moved along the privileged way, with the elect company of those for whom the gifts of life are unrestrained. He had to fight for his position. It seemed not unlikely that he might even have to fight for his daily bread. He had often used the word sordid of the great army of strugglers who composed the majority of every city, the men and women who were too absorbed in the fight for bread to care for the poetries and philosophies. It seemed now that he must descend from his pedestal of privilege and know their anxieties and miseries. It seemed an impossible thing, yet there had been fugitive moments of late when the thought thrilled him. But there were much more frequent moments of pure dismay. That he should fail, and fail too after having tasted success? No, he would not admit it. He would do something novel, striking, impressive. He would put all of his gifts to service as he had never done before. And he had done it. Never had his oratory struck so full a note as in these last months. His wife, his own most gentle and acute critic, had often told him so. His friend Palmer, one of the deacons of the church who lived an intellectual life, had corroborated her testimony. Yet here was the result, this long-postponed and inevitable meeting of his deacons to consider the situation. "It's like this," Deacon Roberts said. "The time has come when we must cut our clothes according to our cloth. There are things I have to do without, not because I don't want them, but because I can't afford them. We've just got to cut down expenses." "Of course, we all know that," replied Deacon Hawking. "That's what we're here for. But will Brother Roberts tell us how?" There was an odd antipathy between Roberts and Hawking. Everyone knew that whatever the one proposed, the other would oppose, and that into these disputes no question of principle ever entered. "I'm not bound to answer," said Roberts. "Yes, you are," retorted Hawking. "What's the use of talking about economy if you daren't say what you mean by it?" Thus challenged, Roberts gathered himself up for a set speech. He was a small, thin man, narrow-shouldered, spectacled, of neat appearance, whose deferential manners concealed a temper of obstinate dogmatism. He had fought his way from poverty to relative opulence, and had learnt nothing in the struggle but the habit of perniciousness. He had a particularly irritating voice, thin in tone, penetrating, and at the same time querulous. Hawking was a large man whose bluff manners covered an equal barrenness of sentiment. The two were very friendly in private life, but they consistently opposed each other on all public business. John Gaunt had treated each with a kind of humorous disregard through the early days of his ministry, but lately had come to regard them with alarm, perceiving in them qualities of opposition of which they had previously given no sign. "Well," said Roberts, "my meaning is plain. The church is declining. It's not for me to say why." Whereupon with the curious inconsistency of the speaker who is mastered by his rhetoric instead of mastering it, he proceeded to discuss the question at large. He gave facts and figures with a deadly fluency. The minister waited in tortured impatience for any generous or illuminating word. The speech was precisely the sort of speech that would be made at a company meeting after a bad year's trade. As Robert spoke in his precise, cold fashion, an almost visible wave of despondency settled over the meeting. Gaunt felt as though he was at his own funeral, hearing the will read.
"Such are the facts,"
Robert continued.
"We can discuss the remedies better at another meeting when the pastor's not present."
"Oh, don't do that," said Gaunt. "I'm quite prepared to hear all that you have to say. Indeed, I ought to hear it, since it concerns me more than anyone else." "Let's hear what the pastor himself has to say," suggested Hawking. "I have very little to say," replied Gaunt, "and I'm not sure that I can say it without giving offense. What has impressed me most tonight is that you all seem to accept defeat as if it were irreparable. I have listened in vain for a note of courage. I may as well let you know at once that I am not of that spirit. I am going on. It's not a time for economy, but generosity. Wise generals don't reduce their forces in the face of the enemy. No doubt we have lost some of our best members. We all know why. They have migrated to the suburbs. But there are more people living at the very doors of this church than there were 7 years ago when I commenced my ministry. I propose to get those people." "We don't want them," interrupted old Deacon Small. "They're not our kind of folk. They won't mix." "They are people, at all events," said Gaunt, with a grave smile. "It may be a misfortune that the church is situated among them, but since it is, the church ought to exist for them more than for anyone else." "That's very well in sentiment, no doubt," retorted the old deacon, "but it won't work. This has always been a church for the rich, and if it changes its character, there are many of us that won't wish to stay in it." Gaunt had it on his tongue to say, "Then let the rich support it," but he was restrained by the recollection of his own attitude of mind in previous years. How often had he been pleased to hear the church described as a church of the rich? He had boasted of it, not in a vain or sordid way, it's true, but he had boasted. It had seemed to him a matter of legitimate pride that his influence had been exerted over rich men. Of course he had done nothing to discourage the poor from attending his ministrations, but he had not wanted them or sought them, or indeed thought much about them. To influence the rich, to attract the men of means, to direct their generosities, was not that, after all, the best way to serve the poor? So he had argued 100 times. Because he had so argued, his tongue was now tied. And yet for a vivid moment he now saw a vision of the poor, the struggling multitude with their pathetic pretense of competence, the daily workers crowded in narrow rooms, the heroic silent throng of uncomplaining lives around him, and he felt the pathos of their lot. But they wouldn't mix? Well, was the sentiment, however offensive it sounded, so far from the truth? And with this question came another which stung him more painfully. Was he the kind of man who had any message for the poor? From the day he had left the seminary, he had grown fastidious, and ever more fastidious in his tastes and habits. Circumstances had helped him. He had lived among people of good manners and easy lives. He had met a good many persons of intellectual tastes, and he had developed wonderfully through the need imposed upon him to understand and interpret their ways of thinking. If his deacons were men of commoner quality, at all events they had admired him. So everything had favored the growth of his intellectualism, but he was dimly aware that every step in this road of cold and fastidious intellectualism had taken him further from the masses of people. He no longer knew the dialect of their thought. He had not the key to their life. In the pride of his mind, he often told himself that it was not necessary for him to speak so as to be understood by common people. Lesser men could do that, but he was a preacher to the cultured, and he demanded a certain sensitiveness of ideas and sympathies in his hearers as the surface on which his own thought could interpret themselves. And now, once more, there flashed upon his mind a faint vision of the poor, as he had read about them in books and newspaper articles. The strugglers who did not read, whose mind lay dim and undeveloped under clouds of drudgery and harassing anxiety. It was a fine thing to say he meant to get these people into his church, but could he? Had he any message for them? Could he himself mix with them? He did not know, but he felt his courage ebbing at the prospect. A cold wave of despondency, which had submerged the meeting, at last rolled over him, too. He became conscious of an immense weariness of his position, of the difficulties that beset him, of life itself. There was no further discussion. One by one the deacons rose and bade him good night. When he went out into the street it was raining, and the city wore its most doleful aspect. He buttoned up his coat and went home with a dismal sense that the triumph of life was over for him. Henceforth nothing awaited him but defeat. That's the end of Chapter 1. Next week we'll pick up with Chapter 2, A Seller of Rhetoric. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.